This is Ron Peters.
I'm John Nugent.
And I'm Sam Long.
Welcome to the After Class Podcast.
Because the best conversations happen
after class.
Thank you for joining us for today's episode
You're
of
welcome.
the After Class Podcast.
Oh, sorry.
Way to jump in there, Sam. Nicely done. Today's podcast is part one of a two-part series where we're going to be taking on some Christmas themes, talking about Christmas-related topics. And to kind of get us all into the mood here around campus, we've been seeing a lot of Christmas themes happening here. Among them was a Christmas contest where students came around and decorated our office doors in a variety of Christmas themes. My office, I'm particularly proud of my office door and the way it looks. I want to give a shout out to Jessica, Carmelina, and Jasmine for really making mine look great. And as far as I'm concerned, it is the winning door.
It is the most spiritual door. You have a manger scene.
And Greek.
It does have Greek.
And Greek words.
Yep. And so they went all out. And I do think it's the winner because there is a contest. There's a voting going on right now. And so all the doors are going to be voted upon, I guess. Yeah.
So it remains to be seen which is the winner because there's still time. I don't know when this contest ends.
Yeah, I don't either. I haven't exactly heard of an ending time. I should point out, though, that your two doors are similar in theme. Both of them have a Grinch theme going on.
There's no premeditation on our part.
No coordination whatsoever. Huh?
Sam did not think at all about what would happen on his door. It just happened.
Correct. My concern about decorating these doors was very low.
And your competitive spirit is not very high.
Not about this. I couldn't care less.
Yeah, John and I are competing a little bit more here.
Yeah.
Yeah, we'll see how it turns out.
Right on.
Or we won't. I really don't care.
But to go along with this competition, or this, not the competition, but the holiday spirit.
Right.
Yeah, some spirit. The spirit of competition. That's what the holidays is about.
The rest of the faculty are also getting in on the podcast for the next
right.
2 episodes.
Yeah, so you want to stay tuned at the very end and make sure you listen to the music as it goes out, because there are going to be a number of holiday greetings from several members of the faculty and staff here at Great Lakes, and we're really grateful for them getting in on the spirit and making a contribution. So yeah, when we get to the end of the podcast, don't just shut it off before the end, but be sure to listen. So with that, I'm going to kick it over to Sam to launch us into our first discussion topic here today.
So today my goal is to ruin Christmas for everyone.
And I'm sure you're going to do it very, very well, Grinchy man over there.
The resident Grinch, I'm happy to take such a task upon me. I don't care about Christmas as much as, say, everyone else in this room.
As the truth.
Fantastic.
Yeah, John and I love Christmas. Big fans.
Yeah, I love real Christmas, which starts on the 25th. Not all this business leading up to it. But
like Advent.
Well, I like that part. I like the spiritual part. I'm the spiritual one in the room. The rest of you people...
If that's how you define spiritualism, okay, fine.
That seems reasonable. Church tradition sounds right.
You sound Gnostic to me, but go ahead.
Hey, they didn't get it all wrong. Discussion for another day.
Right.
So... I am in charge of debunking a lot of thoughts about the Christmas story that people hold near and dear. In good fun, I'm not trying to destroy your faith. Just say there may be a better way of reading the text, which doesn't necessarily line up with what we see in media around us and in all the nativity scenes that you purchase at your local Hobby Lobbies.
Right.
So I want to start with one that Jesus was born at midnight on December 25th. That is a perhaps untrue statement.
All right, now you're really throwing me off.
It's a multiple part there. So it came upon a midnight clear, fantastic song, not based in reality. It's not as though Jesus was born right at midnight or something like the ball drops at New Year's Eve. Right? And then on December 25th. So when was Jesus born, Ron? You're the New Testament guy.
Actually, that's been knocked around a lot. There's I think for a long time the main argument was that he was born more in the springtime. Recently, I read an article, and now I wish I would have done a little bit more prep before the recording.
And by
session.
little, you mean any. So keep going.
Any whatsoever. But within the last year, I did read an article from somebody. I think it was in the Journal of the Evangelical Theological Society, who made an argument that Jesus was born around the time that we celebrate at Christmas time. So that idea has been revived, and at least one scholar has tried to make an argument for that. But I think most have said that it was probably more in the springtime, that it wasn't at or around December 25th.
On what basis?
One of the arguments I've heard that really isn't a very compelling argument is that the shepherds are out, with their animals in the field, and you wouldn't do that in the middle of winter. That seems to be a little bit of a westernization of the story, assuming that, in this tropical location, more or less, that you wouldn't be out in wintertime.
It snows in Israel, so it's not like it's tropical.
When I say tropical, I mean in the latitude on the globe, not tropical the way we think of it.
All right.
But in the actual technical sense of the term. So,
who wants to be technical?
Yeah.
Or actual.
Or real. So, yeah, the reality is we just don't know. I mean, we don't have anything in the Bible that gives us any sense whatsoever of the time of year that Jesus was actually born. And even the date of his birth, in terms of the year, is still a matter of debate.
AD 1.
You're going to bring up that one?
No, but I mean, I could.
Well, I mean, right now,
what year was Jesus most likely born?
So right now, the what you will see in any commentary is either 4 or 6 BC.
Yeah.
Those are the numbers that are usually put out there. Based on our understanding of when Herod the Great actually died, he died before no later than 4 BC. And so when the calendar was originally put together, our modern calendar, the computations were off just a bit. I mean, and that's not to say it's untrustworthy. They did the best they could with the information they had in their possession. But yeah, at this point, it's either 4 or 6 BC. And the time of year, who knows? We really don't know.
Do we know anything about the time of year when censuses are taken? Does that give us anything to work with?
I don't know that, again, I've not read anything anywhere that suggests a census would take place at a certain time. It probably took place over a long period of time. If people are having to relocate or at least go back to their hometowns in order for the census to take place, these movements took a long time. We're used to, the three of us have flown across the country in just a few hours. Something would have taken weeks in the ancient worlds.
It felt longer.
Well, when the three of us are crammed together in seats,
Right.
yeah, it feels a
Sometimes.
lot longer.
But they probably wouldn't plan a census to overlap with the winter season, the rainy season, when it's most difficult to travel.
Seems unlikely, but maybe they didn't care.
My suspicion is that the Roman government probably didn't care that much, and in all likelihood, they would understand that the census is going to take a long time. It's not the instantaneous kind of thing that we can do. So I would think that a census, the very nature of it, would require months and months to complete.
All right.
So no one seems to know the actual date or time period where Jesus was actually born. But how do we get December 25th? Well, I did some research. I don't know if it's accurate, but it's interesting.
Yeah.
So in about 2004, Hippolytus?
Hippolytus.
I'm going with Hippolytus. So he did something very interesting where apparently in the Jewish Talmudic tradition, righteous men die on the same day they're conceived.
Interesting.
But what doesn't for me it doesn't quite work out, because then that would force his conception to also be in March. Well, he put it March 25th.
Okay.
So 9 months after conception comes birth. So if he's conceived on March 25th, 9 months later apparently is December 25th, if my math is correct.
Okay.
Right?
Okay, so he dies at around Passover, which would be late
that
winter,
year
early
could have
spring.
been March, depending upon which year it is.
Push it out 9 months, and that puts you in December.
And so
okay.
if he had to have been conceived on the same day, that would put his actual being born 9 months later.
Gotcha. All right.
Very interesting suggestion of
Yeah.
how we got to December 25th. A lot of people say that it was intentional to go against like a lot of other religious things. I think that's kind of been debunked to some extent.
Yeah, I've heard that argument that it was placed at the time of the winter solstice, which is a pagan festival time.
Of course, the winter solstice was like the 21st, and like the party went to the 23rd, and nothing would have been happening on the 25th.
Yeah, right.
So it's not as though it's I don't know. If you say that, it's kind of like...
And the solstice moves around a little bit. It never falls on the exact same day every year.
Yeah.
Do we have a sense of when December 25th was the chosen time?
Oh, well, if this is correct, 2004-ish.
2004.
Oh.
So it was like
no.
But
14
wait,
years
what do you
ago?
mean?
When did Christians first start celebrating Christmas on December 25th? Like, when in history was that time attributed to the birth
I
of
don't
Jesus?
Oh, yeah, I've not even done that research to know when that became the official date. But, I mean, it's been a part of the church calendar for centuries. Yeah, I'm not aware of a time that it...
Church historians, we are not. Lloyd
right.
Knowles probably knows the answer to this question.
You know, if Lloyd was
Please
here...
put us on our Facebook page.
If you know the answer, put it out on Facebook
Regardless,
for us.
probably wasn't born on December 25th, but that's okay.
Fair enough.
This day has been chosen. This is a day where we remember and celebrate, regardless of it actually being that day.
Yeah, and I've even heard of people who have chosen not to celebrate Christmas because they think that it was the reappropriation of a pagan festival, Saturnalia or something like that. To which I would respond, if that is your logic, I hope you don't have any crosses around, because the ultimate symbol of Christianity is the cross, which was not originally a Christian symbol. We appropriated a symbol that in its time was a symbol of Roman power and death and torture. This was a pagan symbol that when Christians began to use, probably most people would go, "You're sick. You know, you're hanging a cross around your neck," if they were actually doing that. And so, you know, the history of God's people is to take the things of the world and to sort of re-anoint them. In fact, we talked about that in the previous podcast about the story of the flood. That didn't originate in the Bible. That was a story that was floating around in the heathen nations.
Pun intended.
Thank you. It was not intended, but yeah, good. But, you know, they took a story that was hanging out.
I put it out there for you.
I know, and I didn't own it.
Just knocked it off the tee.
I didn't. Dribbled it down the fairway.
It's like when I used to play in Little League.
Pretty much, yeah. Unathletic was I. But my point is that, you know, God's people have taken the things of this world and either circumcised them, like you said last time, John, with the flood, or, you know, we might say baptized with the cross. So why can't we take a pagan festival and say, you know what, you don't get to own this anymore. We're going to dedicate this to Jesus and use it as a time to celebrate his birth.
All right. So we're starting with the date. We'll move on to something I find more intriguing. You often, if you go and see anyone's manger scene, it's a stable, right?
Yep.
So the cattle are lowing. So we have them in the middle of a barn with animals around.
That's what I've got on my door out there. So
It sure is.
Yeah.
Which is why you should not win.
hey, watch it.
Because it doesn't seem to be the case. So if we talk about how they were going to the Joseph and Mary were going to his hometown for the census, one would assume that there would be family around that they could stay with, and that they could, you know, like that's what Christmas is about. People coming and crashing on your house for a week, you know. I'm like, all right, well, we'll put up with
Tryptophan coma from the turkey or whatever.
Yeah, you know, you got to put up with your in-laws and your relatives and stuff. I mean, this is the National Lampoon's Christmas vacation
Right,
situation,
exactly.
right? But in our text, it's translated, there was no room for them at the inn.
Right.
And so it raises the question, why are they staying at an inn? Did Bethlehem even have an inn? And other things of that nature.
Especially a town that small. I mean, we're not even talking about a town. We're talking about a little village. Were they big enough to have an inn?
Not big.
Yeah.
So I wanted to get into the Greek word translated inn, kataluma.
Kataluma.
And the problem is, the other times it's used in the New Testament, not so much an inn,
Right.
right? It is,
When I've seen it, it's been guest room.
right. Or when Jesus says, hey, guys, I'd love to celebrate Passover with you. Can you get a kataluma for me?
Yeah.
He doesn't mean go down to the local Marriott and reserve the ballroom.
Right.
He means there's an extra room in someone's abode that we can use to celebrate this Passover.
Yeah. Exactly. So, yeah, the idea of an inn probably is a really, really poor translation. As you rightly point out, the normal way to go would be to find family members in that community and stay with them. And so no room at the inn probably means no room in the house. If they were lucky enough to have a spare room, it's already packed with people already in town.
Yeah, because everyone's coming there for this silly census.
Yeah, exactly.
And apparently they got there late. Too
Stupid
late
Caesar.
So now they're out on the porch, apparently. So then the question is, so where did they stay?
Right.
And archaeology, if you look at it, there were homes during that time period where the bottom floor was kind of like an open room that a lot of things happened on. It is their living room, their kitchen. At some level, it could have been a place for animals to store them. And all the sleeping in other quarters were upstairs, in a different level.
Right.
And so
Sam's holding his hands up to illustrate the higher level, which you can't actually
for those
see.
who are tuning in on YouTube,
He's making a gesture here that nobody can see.
now I'm making a different gesture that no one can see. So picture this. There's a 2-level dwelling place. Upstairs are perhaps sleeping quarters, which are completely full.
Yeah.
People on top of people.
Right.
There's no room there. So instead, they sleep somewhere else, maybe downstairs in the open common area,
Yeah.
as opposed to in some barn out in the middle of a field.
Right.
But we say, but he was laid in a manger. Well, seemingly, if animals are brought in occasionally, there's a feeding trough sitting there
Yeah.
for the animals. And this has been going around for a while, and slowly it's making its way into the common understanding. But it's taken a while to take root because people just really like the scene of the barn scene, the Christmas barn scene.
I know I do. I mean, I love the nativity scene. To
What's
me,
not to like about it?
exactly? It's part of the nostalgia.
I mean, really?
Well, and it makes me think of when Suzanne and I got married. She was raised Catholic, and then her family became Protestants, but she still retained some of her Catholic vocabulary. And so the nativity scene to her was the Holy Family, and that was just not a part of my Christmas vocabulary. And when she would say that, it just always made me laugh. And to this day, she kind of still retains that. But
The lower level of a house is just hard to market.
it really is.
Right.
How do you make that out of olive wood?
And how do you set that up in your front yard?
Great point, everyone.
Doesn't
Really.
work.
It's all about marketing. So, seemingly, they weren't in isolation in a barn. They were surrounded by a ton of family members above them, maybe even there with them.
Yeah, it doesn't even mean that they were alone. And especially if Mary is giving birth, if there are other women in that house, they're probably right there with her. We kind of have this image of Joseph there being like the dad, driving the mom to the hospital, and they have to pull off to the side of the road, and he delivers the kid in the car or whatever. Yeah, in all likelihood, they were in a situation where they were surrounded by family members, and there were probably other women there who helped with the delivery.
You guys are totally ruining Christmas.
That was my goal at the outset. I'm pretty sure I stated so.
I know, right? We're just rocking everybody's world.
Maybe. Or maybe like, yeah, we've heard this all before. Like, okay, fair
Yeah,
enough.
and if you have, that's great.
Yawn.
Okay.
Tell
I
us
got
something
another
new
one.
after class,
All right,
guys.
let's hear the next one.
You like this one, John. I know you like this one. Oh, well, before we get there, and also when they're like surrounded by cattle, that's not necessarily true. There probably weren't any animals in there with them. Because again, if it's not winter, they're not bringing their animals in
Right.
from the cold. So it's full of people. Like the animals get the short shrift. So, all right.
Cattle are not lowing.
Here we go.
They're outside in the barn.
Right. There's no barn. How many times I gotta tell you? I mean, seriously though, that like people are like everyone's got their 5 acres. Like no, it's houses on top of houses.
Yes.
All right. So, the song "We Three Kings of Orient Are."
Right.
There may be one word in that statement that's correct.
Are?
Are.
Well, Orient's probably
but
accurate.
it depends where you define that, right?
Yeah.
So the
Broadly
idea
defined.
that there are these 3 kings from the mysterious Orient that arrive and follow a star to where Jesus is lying in a manger.
Right.
Okay? So do I need to start debunking, or would anyone else want to jump in for fun?
You're doing such a great job.
Okay.
Yeah.
So
Keep it going.
where to start? We 3. Let's start with 3.
Okay.
Nowhere does it say there are 3.
That's correct.
It says the Magi from
Yep.
the east come along.
But there is something in the text that would make people maybe think three.
Right, the Trinity.
No, that's
So
not
the
what
Trinity came to visit Jesus
Right.
on.
3 gifts.
3 gifts:
Yes.
gold, frankincense, and myrrh.
Which reminds me of a great Seinfeld episode where this couple gets married, and so instead of buying something silly, they all go in on one gift. 4 of them buy a large screen TV.
Oh, I remember.
They
that
go
one,
to
yeah.
take it over, and what happens? Yeah, we're getting divorced. So anyway, such a great episode. But it goes to show, like, multiple people can go in on one gift.
Yeah,
And these seem to be expensive gifts. Maybe there were 10 magi.
Yeah, they just pooled and they got 3 things, but there's a dozen of them.
Or maybe 2 magi had 3 gifts.
That's also a possibility.
That is
Backpacks.
So we got gold, we got myrrh, we got Frankenstein, all coming together to be these gifts. So now tradition holds it. Of course, there were 3 gifts. There were 3 magi, and in fact, we give them names like
Melchior.
Valspar.
Yeah,
What are their names?
I don't remember, but later
Melchior.
traditions identify 3 and give them names. Yeah,
Balthazar,
Belteshazzar.
not Valspar. So tradition
Valvoline.
holds there were 3. There probably weren't. So we 3. So 3's out. Kings again. They're not ever identified as kings. It says magi,
Right.
Which we talk about could be some sort of mysterious religious figure from the Persia area.
Yeah, I think Babylon or Persia would be a really good working hypothesis. And things like magic and especially astrology were widely practiced in those cultures. You combine that with the fact that, especially in Babylon, you have a very large Jewish population where these people might have come into contact with some Jewish beliefs that might have got incorporated into their thinking, maybe informed their progression, not just to the towards the star, but specifically towards Jerusalem. A little syncretism with Judaism there in Babylon. Yeah, so I think Babylon is probably as good as anything in terms of a theory, or Persia, Jewish populations there. But yeah, magicians, astrologers, something along that lines is probably what these guys are. But they come bearing these high priced gifts. So I don't think that we're out of line in seeing them as some sort of perhaps royal delegation of some sort. But kings is probably going well beyond what that word means. The word magi, magos.
And to learn more about the supposed wise men, we encourage you to check out the December issue of Christian Standard magazine.
That's right.
Where it's already in print and on shelves, but it's coming and to be available online on December 22nd.
20 seconds, I think what you said, yeah.
And you can go to christianstandard.com or something like that and look for the December issue. And our first column of the after class, what do we call it?
Biblically correct.
Biblically correct is called the Church of Christ Nativity Heist.
That's right.
So what happens when a conservative Church of Christ discovers that the wise men weren't at a manger?
At the nativity scene.
That is the plot line. So check it out and see the punchline and look for the names of the wise men craftily woven into the story.
Yes, to be clear, it's a column satirical, not necessarily informational.
And
That's
for
right.
some of the actors who are in the Ocean's 8 series, also
11,
Oh, that's right.
12.
8, 9, 10, 11, 12,
Right.
also feature in this column. So we hope you'll check that out.
Yeah. Yes.
You mentioned something that actually is kind of the next possible myth to debunk, is that the wise men show up. Like, it's almost like the timeline that we see is Mary gives birth, they cut the cord, and then knock, knock, the wise men are here, which doesn't seem to be actually the timeline
Yeah.
that takes place. That when they come to visit Jesus, he was probably not 1 hour old,
Right.
but probably 1 to 2 years old.
Easily, yeah.
And reasons in the text, it talks about how that perhaps up to 2 years they show up. It's not in a house anymore, or it's in a house, not this other place anymore. He's called a young child, not a baby. And it makes sense because, after all, Herod, when he finds out, wants to kill all babies 2 years and below.
Yeah.
Now, maybe he's just a psychopath. Well, he probably was, but
Yeah. A little bit.
But seemingly, he's doing the math also, and like, well, we want to make sure we get them all in that timeline. So the Magi show up at some point in the future. It'd kind of be like you guys celebrate Christmas, and then in February, someone knocks on the door and says, "Merry Christmas, we're here." Like, no.
Very belated Christmas.
Yeah, that's not quite how it
But
works.
Santa brings the gifts on December 25th. So that's when the wise men must have brought their gifts to baby
Right,
Jesus.
Right. And
That would be the logic, I suppose.
Doesn't seem to be the case. And, it's hard to say. The other visitors, too, you got your shepherds and all the rest, like, when they're showing up. Like, we crunch the timeline into a few hours when it seems to be elongated.
Yeah.
There's more going on.
But the house bit isn't necessarily a refutation anymore because you've already argued they were probably in a house. So the fact that they get
True.
visited in a
Good
house,
point.
so
They could still be in the same house.
it could be the same house, but
Be the same house.
the
yeah.
word for child is different.
Yes.
Is that the case
Yeah.
for why they would have been older?
Yeah, and the timeline seems to be like they follow the star, and the star seems to not land in Bethlehem, but perhaps somewhere else. Maybe Nazareth.
Ooh, maybe they overshot.
They came to,
If you think about it, they're coming from the east, which it says, Anatole, which just means east. That's where the word Orient, we kings of Orient, it actually does work because Orient just means east. But they would have probably come into Judea from the north. If they're coming from Babylon or Persia, they'd be following the major trade routes, which would take them first through Syria and then south into Galilee, Samaria, then finally into Judea. So if it was Nazareth, they could have easily overshot past Nazareth and came down to Jerusalem or Bethlehem.
yeah. So
Going to Jerusalem would make sense, though. I mean, they're coming from the east looking for the child-born king of the Jews. If you're looking for the child-born king of the Jews, the first place you're going to go to is the capital of the Jews, which is Jerusalem. So it's very logical that they would go there first.
I just wonder how a star settles over
it's a great question.
anything specific, like a house or even a town or even a region.
Yeah. Well, that's where I think that when you really think through what's being said there, they see a star and they interpret that star as the birth of the King of the Jews. So a star appears in the heavens, and this is a portent that the child-born King of the Jews has arrived. Well, where do you go looking for that king? The King of the Jews has his home in the capital city of Jerusalem, and that's where they go. I mean, they don't go to Bethlehem. They go to Jerusalem. And then they find out, actually, the child will be born they go to Jerusalem. It's supposed to be, then they find out he's going to be born in Bethlehem, and they make their way there. So the star just kind of gives them maybe a general sense of direction, and they tie that to a prophecy related specifically to the Jewish messianic expectation. So I don't know that the star really sends them to a specific location per se.
All I know is, what's a good birthday party without some magicians?
Or presents.
Right. So
Are they dressed up like clowns where they're doing like balloons?
Assume that's the case.
Animal balloons.
Balloon animals. That's where the animals came from.
Oh, there you
They
go.
made cows and sheep, and they were lowing. So, I mean, I've got a couple more, but I think that's probably sufficient to ruin everyone's Christmas story.
There are a lot of listeners.
You're welcome.
Yeah, crying right now.
I don't know that's true.
They're just so downcast, crestfallen.
You want to tease us with what the other couple are? And then people can research on their own?
He already tossed aside his papers.
Maybe we've got things like what we talked about doesn't happen on one night. The idea that some of our classic songs, like not Amazing Grace,
Away in a manger.
Away in a manger.
No crying he makes.
Gnostic Jesus.
Like the Jesus who has no emotions.
The
and doesn't
impassive
cry like
God.
a baby.
Yeah.
Like, sure, good luck finding that in the scriptures.
Right.
We'll pass
Taking
on
us to heaven to live with him there.
that. Yes. Well, we've already talked about that in previous podcasts.
Ad nauseum.
So, I mean, things like that. There's others that exist that are a little. I mean, it gets into the weeds a bit. So,
Yeah.
Fair enough.
We'll stop there.
But I'm saying I'm not changing up my nativity scene. Even though I, as a Bible scholar, know a lot of this stuff is not true, doesn't mean I'm changing up my nativity scene.
So I've decided that next year when I have the opportunity, like someone, without fail, someone will give you one of those gingerbread nativity scenes, build your own. I'm gonna make a real first century house and then put my nativity.
I really want to
down
see
there.
that. When you're done with that, we'll have to post a picture.
That'll be fun times.
All right, so we're going to transition from the revisiting kind of Christian traditions that have revolved around the birth of Jesus to some more serious conversation about the texts that talk about the birth of Jesus, and in particular what they mean, and how today we tend to read later Christian understandings about salvation into the birth narratives at the risk of eclipsing some important points that the text is trying to make. And so the text I want to read is from Matthew chapter 1, and I want to focus on the naming of Jesus, but I'll rewind a little bit to verse 18 to kind of set some context. Now the birth of Jesus, the Messiah, took place in this way. When his mother Mary had been engaged to Joseph, but before they lived together, she was found to be with child from the Holy Spirit. Her husband Joseph, being a righteous man and unwilling to expose her to public disgrace, planned to dismiss her quietly. But just when he had resolved to do this, an angel of the Lord appeared to him in a dream and said, Joseph, son of David, do not be afraid to take Mary as your wife, for the child conceived in her is from the Holy Spirit. She will bear a son, and you are to name him Jesus, for he will save his people from their sins. What we want to talk about for the remainder of this episode is the naming of Jesus and what it meant, and in particular, what it would have meant to Joseph and to Mary, that Jesus is named Jesus precisely because he will save his people from their sins. And why this is something to talk about is because people often read this passage as basically saying the same thing as John 3:16. Mm-hmm. For God so loved the world, he gave his only begotten Son, so that whoever may believe in him may have, not perish, but have everlasting life. And that's a passage about Jesus being sent for the world, to save all people. Jesus coming to save you and me. And because we know that Jesus' death isn't just for the Jewish people, but for the whole world, it kind of broke down the wall between Jew and Gentile and made possible the mission to people of all ethnic groups. We assume that that's what the name Jesus is all about. But there's good reason to think that that's not how Joseph would have interpreted. Does anyone want to give a stab at what that is and why?
I think we should talk about what the name Jesus actually means. Here we have, Jesus, which in the Greek text would be Jesus, but comes from the Hebrew name Joshua or Yeshua in Hebrew, which means Yahweh saves or Yahweh's salvation. You guys can help me to refine that. Is it both and, either or? Mm-hmm. And so the idea that his very name means that God, the God of Israel, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, is now going to move among his people to bring about their salvation. And Jesus is going to be the agent of that salvation. And so, I think that our first instinct is to do what good Protestant evangelicals do with the word salvation and make it out to be some sort of, eschatological thing, that we are saved from our sins. We're born, at least according to some traditions, I don't agree, but we're born sinners and we need to be saved from that sin. And Jesus is the sacrifice that does that. But John, I think you're making a very good point that, and I think Matthew, this is where he's going with it, that Jesus is doing something for Israel, that he's going to bring about salvation for that people. And again, that he's going to be the agent of that he is the agent of the restoration of the Davidic monarchy, the long-awaited renewal of Israel, and everything that needs to take place to bring that about. Jesus is going to facilitate that.
Yeah, and the key modifier in that sentence is save his people from their sins.
Yeah.
And his people meant something to first century Jews.
Yeah.
There were specific sins that are in the backstory of that people that they've been paying a price for. You want to kind of give a stab at some of that backstory, Sam?
So in the prophets decried specific sins, idolatry, things we might call social injustice, so taking advantage of the poor and so forth, so perverting justice, so the like a rich getting richer, poor getting poorer type sort of situation. But in all things, it was replacing faith in Yahweh with something else, whether it be faith in another nation that will come and help them and save them, or in themselves, or whatever else. It's just not living the life that the Torah lays out. So turn their back on Torah, which is their covenant with their God, which is then turning their back on God. And so the exile is the consequence of that. Having come back from exile, we see a people that they don't seem to struggle with idolatry anymore. That's not the problem after the exile. But at the same time, they don't seem to be. So we have the new religious groups cropping up, trying to live it out in different ways. The Pharisees get a bad shake all the time, but really what they're trying to do is live out the Torah as specifically as they can, which means they make extra rules to make sure they don't break the Torah. Yeah. And we have those sorts of things play into it. But there were some sellouts still. So we have the whole Maccabean period where they're trying to toe the line between, well, I'm a Jew, but I also don't want to be persecuted. I'm tired of being persecuted, so I'll sell out a little bit. So if, we want to bring the Sadducees into that and all the rest. So there are lots of things going on, but in the first century, it seems like they're still not living out the Torah ethic that they're being called to. It's not idolatry anymore, but it's not this set-apart people that they're supposed to be.
Yeah, and I'd like to go back and focus on a little bit of that exile period you talked about. Sure. And Sam's exactly right. God called Israel to live a very specific kind of life that was supposed to be a witness to the nations. In Torah, he lays out a design for peoplehood that is amazing in its economic justice, in its judicial justice, in its right worship. And it was an integral system that was so different from the nations around them that it would be salt and light, and it would attract all nations to God's people. And in rejecting Torah, breaking the covenant, and having things all fall apart, and they're not living in God's blessing, and they try to fix it by asking for a king like the nations. Mm-hmm. And when they ask for a king like the nations, and God warns them, this is a big mistake, but I'll let you do it. You're not going to like how it's going to go, but if this is how you have to learn, here we go. They become just like the nations they're supposed to be set apart from. Yeah. And God tolerates that for a while. And but eventually he brings in Assyria to dismantle the northern kingdom, and Babylon to dismantle the southern kingdom. And God removes that king that they wanted. And they never really get a true king back. Right. Yeah. He removes their independence as a nation. From this point forward, except for a brief time in the Maccabean era, Israel exists as a people underneath a foreign empire like Babylon, and then Persia, and then Greece, and eventually Rome. And so they've lost national independence. They no longer have a king. They have to live under the rules of other nations, which means there's so much in Torah, even if they wanted to live out, they couldn't. Yeah. Because the governors are pagan governors who have their own laws in the land, many of which conflict directly with Torah. Exactly. And so, God comforted them with prophets to say that, this punishment that you're receiving, losing all your independence, having to live under foreign occupation, some of them being relocated to other parts of the world to serve pagan kings there. This is all part of God's punishment for their sins of breaking Torah and choosing kingship like the nations and nationhood like the nations. And the prophet said that comforted God's people. I especially think of the middle portion of Isaiah, anticipating a day when they will be freed from foreign occupation, where they will have their own king, where righteousness will be lodged in them again, and the Holy Spirit would be poured out. They waited for this day. And when Persia conquers Babylon and sends many of the Jews back to Babylon, back from Babylon and from Persia to live back in the land of Palestine, the Jews feel like, this is it. We're being restored. God's forgiven us for our sins. and we're becoming that great nation that's going to be a light to the world. But that's not how it goes.
Right.
Their return from exile is extremely disappointing.
Yeah.
They're still under foreign occupation. They don't have their own king, really.
Yeah.
They just have local Jewish leaders. They're not impressive. The nations still look at them as the bottom of the heap socially and politically. And then they just kind of dredge on. Like, we're back in the land, but it's not what we thought it would be. We've got a puny-sized version of the temple functioning again, but it's a joke compared to the temple in Solomon's day.
Right.
We've got walls around our city, but it's a tiny little city. There's nothing impressive about them.
Yeah.
And so, again, the prophets have to encourage them to say, God's not done with you. And matter of fact, the prophecy of Daniel 9, people are like, we're still in slavery, is how they pray. We're still in slavery, and the prophecy is, God has multiplied your punishment 70 times sevenfold. While he was angry for a bit, he's multiplied it sevenfold. And so the time of their punishment for their sins is like 490 years, not 70 years.
Yeah.
And that leads a lot closer to New Testament times. And so Israel is waiting for its restoration. It knows it has been unfaithful to Torah. It's trying to be faithful, like Sam said with the Pharisees, almost trying too hard to be faithful and becoming legalists. and it's just still waiting for that restoration when God is going to set world history straight, forgive Israel from its sins, restore them to be that great nation that God can use to be a light to all nations. And it's in that context that an angel tells Joseph, your wife is pregnant with a son, and you will call him Jesus because he will save his people from his sins.
Yeah. I think one thing that is often overlooked or not even really recognized is the hunger they had for a righteous king. The leadership that they had at that time in the form of the Sadducees, their priestly caste, was, for most people, anything but a righteous leadership. You see in the writings of Josephus that the priests had a tendency to compromise a lot in order to maintain their power by cooperating with Rome. Now I'm drawing a blank where Jesus even castigates them for stealing the land, stealing the property of widows. You have a leadership group that are supposed to be the ones who train people in righteousness and Torah, and who exemplify what living that out looks like. And they're not. They're, as the word you keep coming back to, John, is like the nations. And you have a leadership group in the form of the Sadducees and the Sanhedrin broadly, who look a lot like the nations around them. They like their power, like they like their wealth, and they collaborate with Rome, and they compromise. And so the people are looking forward to a kind of draining of the swamp, to use a modern term. They want to see that leadership purged and a righteous king established, a king who is going to get rid of that sin in their leadership and, as you rightly point out, lead the people into this new golden age where righteousness defines the land, the people in the land of Israel. So part of the sin they're seeing is the sin of their own government, which is, very, very much like what you see in the Old Testament prophets.
But I mean, you really have to, I think, like John was saying, it wasn't 70 years. It was 70 times 7 years. I mean, like children who are grounded, it's like they know I'm grounded for a week. When that, they're getting closer and closer. Finally, I get whatever back, my device, the car, whatever.
Yeah.
They're getting so close. They know it's right there. But imagine if you're grounded for 490 years. I mean, that's the longing that we're talking about here.
Yeah.
That he's speaking into. The finally being restored and getting that thing back that they've lost for so long.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't think we can really comprehend what that's like.
Yeah.
I mean, as a nation, we haven't even been around 490 years.
Right.
And as a people, so.
And you have all these promises that say to you, it's going to happen. The prophets that you revere are saying this will happen. And there's just that fervor is high. And you came so close under the Maccabees. Like, you came so close. We were independent briefly. And it looked like because we were so zealous for God and his Torah that God gave us victory over our enemies. And then the whole thing just falls apart. And it's like, oh, we had it in our hands. And now that was only roughly 150 years before Jesus' birth. And so, yeah.
Yeah. So this word from the angel, I mean, it has specific content to it.
Right.
There was a people, a specific people,
Yeah.
Israel, and there were sins, specific sins, the sins of Israel that led to God taking away everything, that led to a promise that he's going to restore you in a coming day. And so this was a gospel message. This is a different way of saying the kingdom of God is at hand.
Right.
Yeah.
The new age in world history promised by the prophets of Israel, where God would set world history right, is beginning. Jesus, the Savior, is being born. And I fear, and of course, this is going to lead to Jesus dying on the cross and breaking down the wall between Jew and Gentile, and Jews reaching out to Gentiles like us, including them into the people of God. So it's going to lead to John 3:16. But it's important not to skip over what happened before John 3:16.
Yeah.
For God to be a promise-keeping God, he first has to keep his promise to Israel.
Yep.
And then through Israel to keep his promise to the world.
Yeah.
And if we skip by the fact that Jesus came to restore Israel, we miss so much of the New Testament story.
Yeah. Yeah, that idea of the gospel being the gospel of the kingdom, that's repeated over and over in the Gospels. And if we take the four Gospels as the gospel message, which many people don't. I mean, there are people who argue that nobody preached the gospel till Paul. And that's just ludicrous. The Gospels are the gospel, and that is the gospel of God fulfilling his promises to Israel and raising up Jesus as their king and establishing them again as a kingdom, but now a kingdom with a radically new vision, so radical that Paul called it a mystery. Like none of us saw it coming. God is fulfilling everything he said he was going to do, but it was a mystery. And now that it's been revealed, we're like, holy cow, this doesn't even look like what we thought. But sure enough, it fulfills everything God said he was going to do.
Yeah. And I would add, it only seems so radical because the Jewish expectation wasn't necessarily informed by a careful reading of the law and the prophets. In other words, I mean, the Jews who rejected Torah's vision of politics and economics and justice, and they wanted a king like the nations, it seemed like when God dismantled the whole king project and told them that he was going to send them a king, they're like, oh, great, we're going to get our king like the nations. Like they're still looking for what they've always been looking for.
Right.
But it's not like in the Old Covenant and in the Old Testament and in the prophets, God set them up to want this king like the nations. He never wanted a king like the nations to begin with. Yeah. He weaned them off a king like the nations. Yep. I mean, Isaiah is screaming as loud as it can, God's people and the ruler God's going to send them is not going to be like the nations. Yeah. So when Jesus comes and he's not a king like the nations, it's not in subverting all that the Old Testament prepared them to think. It's that they still want to see, when do we get to be on your left hand and your right? When do we get to be great? Right. When do we get a king like the nations and rule like the nations? Jesus is the king they've always been waiting for, but the one they've never waited for.
Yeah. He's subverting their popular expectations, but not subverting the plan that God had and laid out for them. Exactly.
Yeah. So that's just a little bit of insight this week. I think that's going to be enough to wrap up our first Christmas episode.
Yeah.
Hope you learned something about the nativity from Sam.
Yep.
And something about the gospel from the angel who spoke to Joseph.
Amen. All right. So with that, we'll wrap up. Thanks for joining us for today's After Class podcast, because
the best conversations happen.
Bah humbug. And after class.
This is Ryan Apple, professor of music, wishing you a Merry Christmas from me and my guitar.
Hi, this is Mike Harrison, Vice President of Academic Affairs at Great Lakes Christian College. From my office to your office, from my home to your home, have a Merry, Merry Christmas.
This is Kate Blakely, Professor of Cross-Cultural Ministries here at Great Lakes Christian College, wishing you the peace of the Prince of Peace this season and for all seasons to come.
This is Ryan Bushnell, the Dean of Students at Great Lakes Christian College, hoping that your Christmas is as restful and relaxing as mine will be, enjoying 3 weeks with no students on campus.
Hi, this is Matt Allison, Professor of Psychology and Counseling. Just want to wish you and your family a wonderful holiday season. From my family, Jesse, Caroline, Cecilia, Magdalene, Eleanor, and Benedict. We live here and we are so blessed to be a part of this community. God bless.
Hi, this is Lloyd Knowles, college professor in history, but more known as the court jester during the madrigals. Just wanted to wish you a Merry Christmas, and remember that as we give each other gifts, that the most important person to give a gift to is Jesus. And how do we do that? We serve and love his sheep.